the Chinese Communist Party is not just a normal government that you can have normal relations with. It needs to be called out as an ideological threat and enemy to the United States, which is something the Trump administration did. They were very good about specifically pointing out, Mike Pompeo in particular.
Robert O'Brien, they made speeches about calling out the Chinese Communist Party and talking about the ideology, which is essentially, again, what the CCP doesn't want, because they want to have the fiction that they are just like any other country, you know, with a president, right? They call Xi Jinping the president of China. He wasn't elected by anybody. Right. He's the general secretary of the Communist Party. That is his highest title. That is why he is the quote-unquote president of China.
It's no secret that relations between the United States and China are anything but cordial. In what is being dubbed Cold War 2.0, Washington and Beijing are furiously competing head-to-head in every realm imaginable, from technology to trade, foreign aid to military prowess, and from soft power to control over global institutions. However, the most crucial area of confrontation might in fact be the information space. In today's hyper-connected world, the battle over the narrative is just as crucial as the fight over land or resources. The Chinese Communist Party completely understands this, which is why they spend billions annually to propagandize Western audiences. Unfortunately, America has been quite slow to respond on the state level.
Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability.
This is where China Uncensored enters the chat. Since founding China Uncensored in 2012, Chris Chappell and his host, aka humor ninja Shelley Zhang, have been working to bring audiences China-focused news with a little bit of comedy mixed in. Since launching, China Uncensored has garnered hundreds of millions of views on YouTube alone, in no small part thanks to their banger titles, including 6 toxic Chinese products found in the US, China throws a tantrum at the Olympics, and why did China just kill millions? Indeed, why? Needless to say, China Uncensored has become a major thorn in the side of the CCP. In a 2020 article, state media outlet China Daily referred to China Uncensored as, quote, disgraceful anti-China garbage. It's quite the endorsement. So, are Chris and Shelley actually spewing garbage, as Mario Cavallo at China Daily says? Or do they maybe have a point? Why don't you just decide for yourself? All right, so today we welcome to Let's Talk About It, Chris and Shelley. So Chris and Shelley, thanks for coming. Glad to have you here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes our two spheres cross over a little bit, but I think our audience will have a lot to gain from getting to know about you and your program and what you do. So without, beating around the bush too much, for the people in our audience that may not be familiar, could you just tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got started, and sort of, as China Uncensored, what brought you to China Focus Media?
Sure. So we started China Uncensored way back in 2012, which is a frighteningly long time ago now. But the idea was that, the Chinese Communist Party, China, was having a big impact on the U.S. But in 2012, hardly anyone was talking about it. It was kind of still fresh off of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. People had all this kind of rosy view of what was going on in China. This was pre-pandemic, pre-Hong Kong protests. And we wanted to help Americans realize that the Chinese Communist Party is a very active threat to America. And happily, we have been proven correct.
I don't know if happily is the word. Yeah. Unfortunately, we were right. Yeah.
If only they listened to me, maybe there would have been no COVID. That's the kind of arrogance I bring to the show.
That's all right. I try to hide my arrogance, but it comes out sometimes. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to really be arrogant about. That's the big problem. But what is if you don't mind explaining a little bit, what background do you both have, and what was kind of was there a moment where you're like, wow, this is something I need to focus on, and I really want to put my creative energy and my financial well-being and everything kind of at risk to just sort of attack this problem that you started seeing to come up?
Well, fortunately, I didn't have financial well-being, so there was nothing on the line for me. I think the big moment Well, there was interesting political intrigue in China at the time with the guy called Bo Xilai, all this stuff that's too dense to go into right now. But I think the big thing was when China was building artificial islands in the South China Sea and saying, hey, this is our territory, we own everything now, which just seemed like such a ludicrous thing.
Yeah, and then Xi Jinping went to the White House and had like a state dinner with Obama, and then they had a press conference on the White House lawn where he promised never to militarize the islands in the South China Sea, and then less than a year later they were militarized.
Yeah.
So you're saying we shouldn't take him at his word? Is that what I'm getting here?
That would be helpful.
Okay, noted.
Yeah, and the thing with the show is we try to use humor to make it interesting. At the time, we were like, yeah, we should do like maybe if it was like the Daily Show, but just about China. People would be into it. This was at a very different time in the Daily Show's production.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of an evolution on that side too, but I think that's kind of why our audiences might gravitate towards each other a little bit, not necessarily because of the subject matter or because of certain political views, but the use of humor as a conduit to talk about actual important issues. So have you ever ran into I don't want to call it a problem, but is there ever a conflict between, say you're talking about Xinjiang or something that obviously has very heavy implications, using humor in those situations? How do you balance the humor side with the hard-hitting political angle that you might need to take?
We somehow find a way. Like even when we're talking about China harvesting the organs of political prisoners en masse,
you can make really dark jokes about organ harvesting. It turns out, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so many times you can say "eat your heart out." We evolve. We figure out new ways to do it. It's really what's kept us sane and being able to do this show for so long.
And I think also the Chinese Communist Party they're so mockable. Like, I think that's part of it too, is that, we're not making fun of Chinese people. We're not like punching down on people. It's like you are going up against the biggest authoritarian power in the world. Like, there's endless things to make fun of them for, and they really hate it. So that's, I think, part of the joy in making this show is that, like, you can't run out of material. I mean, if you just look at Chinese propaganda for a single week, like, you would have endless material to go on for a long time.
Oh, yeah. One of our favorite things to do here, like related to China, every once in a while, we'll pick out I think it's Xinhua produces these sort of parodies of Sherlock Holmes or James Bond. And they're just, to imagine that a government worth, trillions of dollars in gross domestic product is putting out that quality of propaganda. It's like you said, it's endlessly mockable.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like the entire Chinese state behind this garbage. There's nothing really comparable in the U.S. It's amazing.
Well, that's kind of what I want to throw to this next question then, because they're one of the largest states to ever exist. They have endless financial resources, yet they seem to be very concerned about what's happening on the American internet, especially shows like yours, because I love you throw this in your, I guess, merch plug sometimes, but I really like it, how you highlight how China Daily called you disgraceful anti-China garbage. What's the origin of this story? Did you put out a specific post or clip, or what prompted them to be so heavily invested in your show?
That was one of my proudest moments.
I think we have a framed copy of that paper in our...
We have it somewhere.
Oh, yep. Here we go. We have a framed copy of this.
Let's see it. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. We got it. Where's the camera? Right here. So it's real. It's real. What happened was this was from the early days of the pandemic, and we had done a piece called, I think it was, it doesn't say in here, but it was something about along the lines of the cure for the coronavirus is not authoritarianism. And there was this issue of a lot of Western media being like, China's got it figured out. Freedom and democracy is getting in the way of a robust COVID response.
Efficient authoritarian lockdowns. That this was a time when people were obviously very scared, but then there was a lot of weird praise coming from like the World Health Organization, where they had World Health Organization officials saying, if I were to be in the pandemic, I would want to be in China. And the CCP was producing all of this propaganda that was, essentially trying to change the COVID narrative, first of all, to be like, we didn't cause it, it wasn't, and also we're doing such a great job. They even produced some things early on that were like in February of 2020, they produced this piece that was basically like essentially praising themselves for keeping COVID in China and saving the rest of the world. Like, this is obviously before it spread massively throughout the world, but their whole propaganda apparatus was focused on what a great job they were doing fighting the coronavirus. So we were essentially making fun of them and saying, like, authoritarianism is not the way to fight this. And they got really mad about it.
They took issue with us calling it an authoritarian crackdown because, I'll read it, during a human tragedy, we need a lot of love and compassion. And I guess me showing video from inside of China of like them taking a woman and shoving her into an iron box as she's screaming was not showing the love and compassion of the Chinese Communist Party.
The only better love and compassion I remember is when all the celebrities sang John Legend's, or not John Legend, who was it? John Lennon's Imagine or whatever.
I hate that song so much.
I hate it even worse after that. But sort of to your point, how you were talking about the pandemic, why do you think so many Western institutions and Western leaders and governors were so quick to praise China? That's one of the things that really bothered me the most is you have your United Nations and your World Health Organizations and even elected leaders in the United States praising China as the model to do things. Why do you think that happened?
It really was bizarre, and there were a lot of different things happening all at the same time with COVID. I mean, first of all, you had Dr. Peter Daszak, head of the EcoHealth Alliance, who was doing bat coronavirus research in China at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, being quoted as an authoritative voice saying there's no way this came from a lab. It's impossible.
I think we didn't really figure out what was happening with that until after he was, mooted about as the authority on this. But I think, like, with things like the WHO, like, China had spent many years subverting the WHO ever since the SARS outbreak in 2004, where the WHO came in and actually forced them to open up some of the hospitals where they were hiding SARS cases in Beijing. And they actually did like a robust investigation into that SARS outbreak that didn't affect us in the US so much, but spread to a lot of places in Asia and was like an even more deadly respiratory disease. So ever since the WHO did that, then the CCP made it their mission to essentially take over the WHO. So after that incident,
really, I can't stress it enough. The way the WHO reacted to that SARS outbreak was so radically different.
Yes. And so the Chinese Communist Party, they used their influence to get somebody from Hong Kong who was like a government official that was backed by the Communist Party to be the next head of the WHO. This is the person who was prior to Tedros. And then after her stint was over, they used their influence to get Tedros in. So this is like they started this very systematic campaign to influence and take over the WHO, just like they've done with the UN, just like they do with a lot of international bodies that they become part of. So it was definitely not an accident that the WHO started coming out and praising the CCP. As for American officials, what do you think about that, Chris?
It's really, I mean, part of my reporting at the time was just the kind of utter shock of seeing, like the New York Times and all these other major media and American officials just resorting to this kind of unscientific, authoritarian extreme. It was bizarre. I mean, it wasn't as bad as Australia, but...
Right. No, one thing that really shocked me and was how quick, I guess, it was that Western institutions, Western media especially, was to jump on, sort of fall victim to the racist card to spread the CCP's narrative. For instance, if you refer to it as the Wuhan or the China virus, or if you said it came from a lab, if you even had that theory, you were shouted down as someone that was xenophobic and racist. And you remember there was the whole Stop Anti-Asian Hate movement that came out of it. And it seemed to be, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this was Western media and Western journalists towing the party line and reporting on the facts exactly how the CCP would want you to report on them.
Yeah, as I recall how it happened, I think it was first Senator Tom Cotton, who was, I think this was in February of 2020, was already talking about, that it came from China, the lab leak
idea.
And then it was the New York Times who had, was it the Chinese ambassador?
Might have been the Chinese ambassador.
I think it was the Chinese ambassador, write an op-ed in the New York Times describing these kinds of claims as racist.
Right.
And then using that, a top CCP official, they use that to play the race card all the way up and down. And then especially once Trump started using it.
I think that, so this is a confluence of domestic U.S. political interests and the Chinese Communist Party also knowing how to push those buttons and understanding, one of their biggest things that they try to do is divide the people that they consider their enemies. So whether that is Hong Kong dissidents or whether it is the entire United States of America, they will try to foment division among people and really use that unrest to their advantage. So when it came to this Stop Asian Hate stuff, I don't think it was all originating with the CCP, but they definitely understood how to use that. And then you could see in their propaganda, they started to equate Stop Asian Hate with don't criticize China.
And don't say that it came from a lab.
Yeah. So
that's really racist.
So they could take things that people were actually concerned about and then kind of twist it to meet their own agenda.
Well, it seems like they've been very successful in one area, and that seems to be with white, Western, 20-something males on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram to spread their message. You play on it all the time, the Wu Mao stuff, right? Or the kind of the white monkey crossover into the Wu Mao army doing China's bidding. And I don't want to name names of any of these shills, but I'm sure you're aware of who they are. How does China co-opt so many young Western, mainly American males to spread this message? And it's basically always, China isn't that bad. China's actually safer. China's cleaner. Don't look at America. America's dirty and racist and everyone's shooting each other. Look to China for guidance. So first, when you encounter that argument and those kind of people, how do you respond to it?
Yeah, one of the Communist Party's biggest propaganda talking points now is how they're a democracy and the best democracy, but because they changed the definition of democracy. I think there's a confluence of several different things. One is just there has been this Marxist ideology spreading independently in the United States that the CCP can take advantage of, that does see the U.S. as the oppressor. And so in that context, then China must be this alternative that is just being maligned by, the evil imperialist U.S. I think that is definitely, I remember we talked, this wasn't quite China related, but we talked to this guy at May Day rally who was telling us about how great things were in the DPRK.
Yeah. He was like, we asked him, would you rather live in North Korea or in America? And he was like, oh, definitely the DPRK. I think
he wouldn't call it North Korea.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Millions of Americans are starving.
I think, though, that the kind of propaganda about America being a terrible country and crime-ridden and stuff, the CCP is really good at that because that is all that they do. Every night, at the same time, on all channels inside China domestically, the same news program plays, Xinwen Lianbo, which is the CCP's propaganda news, and they always the first section is all about praising the leaders and Xi Jinping and what he's been doing, and then how great they are and what all the things they're doing to help the country. But when you get down to the third section, which is international news, it is always about how terrible the rest of the world is, especially the U.S., how much crime there is, how violent it is. I mean, you have Chinese people who think that, like, if you walk down the street in America, you could get shot, like, at any moment.
That's only in Chicago, so.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're probably more afraid of Texas.
Hey, come on now.
But I think that's the kind of, I've had people in China ask me this before, like, aren't you worried about, like, are you going to, like, how bad is the violence? Because they really think it is that bad
anarchy.
because it's constantly, that is what is amped up all the time in their domestic propaganda. So it's not too much of a, it's not too hard to switch that around and use that for outward facing propaganda, like their English language propaganda as well. It's the same essential idea that, China is stable, like the Communist Party brings stability and prosperity, and, these these Western liberal democracies are just full of chaos. And so it'll be very similar to the messages that you see, like these younger guys that you're talking about. And I also think if you're talking about people who are living inside China, I mean, they are essentially, a lot of them have been co-opted by the CCP for propaganda purposes. Like, there were a lot of China-based YouTubers who were brought to Xinjiang in the last few years to do specifically propaganda tours where they go around and say, I don't see any locked up Uyghurs here. There's no genocide.
They're just happy Uyghurs dancing around in their traditional clothing.
Constantly.
And
all the time, just dancing.
Yeah, they don't even need to have jobs. They're all taken care of by the CCP.
Yeah, and then one of those YouTubers will happen to bump into a CCTV journalist, like a state propaganda journalist, in the middle of this farm in, Zhang.
When we're talking about ham-fisted propaganda.
Yeah, so and then she'll interview him about what the CCP is doing here is great. They're really lifting people out of poverty. Yeah, it's very, I think a lot of the people who live in China have these like YouTube followings and stuff like that. It's easy to be co-opted by the CCP because you're living there, and it's much easier to you being constantly bombarded with this propaganda, and so it is much easier to believe. And maybe in your personal life you don't see the repression, you know what I mean, if you're not actively talking to people who are house Christians or different dissidents or pro-democracy people. Like, you just see people living their lives and you're like, actually China is getting a bad rap from the West because you don't see it. They're really good at keeping a lot of that like underground.
Yeah. So it's possible not all of these people are like knowing shills. They might just actually believe the propaganda themselves.
No, for sure. And it surprised me. I met probably the most famous, I guess you would categorize him as Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, shill. I think we know who we're talking about. I met him and he wanted to celebrate the virtues of communism and why we needed America. And his example was the 5-year plans in Xinjiang. And so I was like, I don't really know how I can have a further conversation with you if you actually believe that, because there's so much evidence that points to the contrary. So it does shock me, and I want to get to your Hong Kong-based stuff for sure. But before we do that, what I want to ask you, especially for our audience, they get wrapped up in domestic issues, and rightfully so. They're worried about their jobs and our immigration and crime in our country. And, I understand it. So as two journalists yourselves that are focused on China, how would you speak to someone that says, okay, we have enough problems here in America. We don't need to worry about what's going on in China. We don't need to worry about the Taiwanese people or in Hong Kong. Let's just fix what we got going on here. Why should somebody in America actually care what's going on in China?
I mean, I get those claims. That's largely what we've been trying to battle against on the show. I mean, obviously, something like COVID shows that we're a very connected world. But there's a variety of ways that the Chinese Communist Party is having a direct negative impact on the U.S. I mean, number one, this is a simple explanation. They're getting incredibly violent in the South China Sea with the Philippines. The U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. If a red line gets crossed, then the U.S., according to this alliance treaty, has to get involved. And so then that's the U.S. military involved in actions against China, which is a nuclear power. Also, I mean, with COVID, we saw how messed up things got with the supply chain. And that was with the entire world trying to fix it. If China successfully controls the South China Sea and Taiwan, they control $5 trillion of shipping a year. They could sanction the U.S. as just one example of what they could do, not to mention the loss of international prestige that would come with that.
I mean, I think you even just looking domestically, fentanyl is coming from China. Yes, it's coming through the cartels in Mexico, but the fentanyl precursors are being made in China. The Chinese Communist Party tries to claim that they can't stop this. They're an authoritarian regime that can literally track someone down for making a Twitter comment about Xi Jinping when he's in America and then imprison him when he goes back to China. These are people
It's come out that they're giving tax subsidies to these fentanyl.
If they want to, they could stop the fentanyl from being, those precursor chemicals from being exported. They're giving tax breaks, to people who export this. So it's not that they don't know what's happening. That there are many things that they're doing that their goal is to directly weaken the U.S. I talked a little bit earlier about how they try to find division among cultural issues in the U.S., like the racism and different issues, and they try to use that to divide American people because the Chinese Communist Party sees America as its greatest enemy and its greatest challenge. So they want to weaken the U.S.
Yeah, the problem is many Americans do not. They think we don't want a war with China. The reality is China is already at war with the United States. They talk about this openly. They need to destroy the United States, and they're working towards that goal. So, I mean, there's secret Chinese police stations in New York. They are actively trying to undermine the U.S. It's a threat that cannot be ignored.
What is their end goal? Why are they working so hard? I guess to flip the question, why does China care so drastically about what's happening in the United States? Why are they putting so much of their resources and efforts into subverting our way of life?
Marxist-Leninist ideology is in the Chinese constitution. It's their driving ideology, and it's their worldview that there is a current international order led by the United States. And in order for China, under the Chinese Communist Party, to rise, it has to undermine that system. And that's why you see China working with the Global South, with the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to buy off all these other authoritarian countries, trying to gain influence in the United Nations and the WHO. And COVID is a great example. We saw what Chinese influence over the UN and WHO did around the world, because they towed the party line, and it cost Americans lives. This is their goal. They cannot exert the kind of control that they want internationally unless they become the dominant power.
And I think very much they don't want to be. I think a couple years ago, the U.S. State Department, Anthony Blinken, he made this speech about how China needs to become part of the international world order. They need to show that they want to be a responsible member of the international world order. That is not what the Chinese Communist Party wants. If you look at their policy proposals, if you look at the speeches Xi Jinping makes, if you look at what's in their, ideological, documents and the journals that they publish, they want a China-led world order, and they cannot have that without first weakening and defeating the U.S.
Well, yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. And I think more and more Americans are starting to realize, like you said, after COVID, that the world is very interconnected. And so there's at least some merit in starting to pay attention to what's going on in other places and how you can, do your part to counteract that, if you will. That's kind of why I want to jump to what we talked about a little bit off camera, which I was very interested in. And when the Hong Kong protests were taking place, I was actually in South Korea. I lived over there for 5 years, so that's sort of where most of my focus is on the North Korea, South Korea stuff. But I was tangentially aware of what was going on in Hong Kong because a lot of the businesses that were located in Hong Kong started relocating to Seoul at that time. So we were getting, I guess, the spoils of China's mistakes. But you were there during the time of the protest for the extradition bill and the new security laws. So just give a little background on what happened in Hong Kong, what you saw when you were there, and kind of what's going on with Hong Kong today?
Well, I think Hong Kong, it's really important for the world to know what's going on in Hong Kong because it reveals a lot about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party made an agreement with the UK that when the UK gave Hong Kong to China, that it would be operated under one country, two systems, that Hong Kong would get to keep a lot of the freedoms and democracy. Well, they didn't have democracy, but a lot of the freedoms that was impossible anywhere else in China. And very clearly, we see that the Chinese Communist Party does not care about agreements it makes with other countries. So that should be something everyone pays attention to, especially people like John Kerry, who keep talking about, we got to work with China on climate change. You can't make agreements with this regime because they have their own agenda.
I mean, they literally said a few years ago that agreement they made with the UK is not valid anymore.
As soon as it got handed over, the agreement didn't matter. They could do anything they wanted. And they ultimately did. What happened in the 2019 extradition protest? So the Chinese court system has a 99.9 conviction rate.
It's pretty good.
Very effective. Pretty good. So the concern was that this extradition bill that was being pushed in Hong Kong would mean that people in Hong Kong, instead of being tried under the separate Hong Kong judicial system, could get sent to mainland China for that wonderful legal system they have there. And that obviously terrified people, especially Hong Kong's business leaders, because doing business with China requires a degree of corruption. And that really put this extradition bill really put them at risk that they could be sent to China and then just have everything taken. So there was first a 1 million person protest, a march in the city. A few weeks later, there was a 2 million person march, and this was in a city of about 7 million. I have never seen so many people on the streets.
Yeah, it was very interesting because prior to this, there had been protests in 2014 in Hong Kong asking the Chinese Communist Party to hold up their agreement and give Hong Kong universal suffrage, like give them the right to vote for their leader, which they were promised. And then the Chinese Communist Party was like, never mind, actually, we'll let you vote for this guy, but only after we first pick the candidates for you.
That's convenient.
Yeah, right. So there was a protest there, but eventually the protest ended, like they started, and then the Hong Kong government started arresting protest leaders and stuff like that. So I would say before 2019, like the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement was at a low point. Nobody expected really like millions of people to come out on the street. But the threat about being sent to China was so great to people that they really were afraid. And they saw also through the years, Hong Kong was given back to China in 1997 by the UK. And they saw over the decades like this chipping away at their freedoms, at what like little democracy they had. They knew that the Chinese Communist Party essentially wanted to turn Hong Kong into just another part of China. So 2019 was a huge reaction against this larger issue of like being like, no, we want our freedoms. We don't want you to take them away. And in response, the Hong Kong government, under the CCP, like the police came out in force, lots of tear gas, lots of pepper spray. The Hong Kong police used to be known as Asia's finest. They were considered like some of the most upstanding, nonviolent like police. And then between the 2014 Hong Kong protests and the 2019 Hong Kong protests, there were, claims that they were trained in China by the Chinese police, and they came back with completely different like tactics to really use violence to try to suppress the protests.
I mean, we were there for both protests, and the change from 2014 to 2019 was immense. They were scary.
And so you had this almost like pitched battle going on between the protesters who were not willing to back down and the police over months and months of time. And we were there in June of 2019 when it started, and then in October, which is National Day for China, and there were huge protests then. And then it only stopped because of COVID, essentially. Because of COVID, the Hong Kong government was able to like lock everything down and be like, nobody's allowed to be in public with more than two people.
Yeah, it seems like a bunch of governments found it very convenient to use COVID as a means to kind of do what they always wanted to do anyway. So with Hong Kong, I mean, in a lot of ways, the citizens were successful in showing, that protest and pushback against the CCP is possible, but also unsuccessful in the fact that these laws did get passed and now they've been implemented. And now, as you've said, they're being used to, arrest people for criticizing the party, even when they're out of the country and doing so. So what's the state of Hong Kong now? Is it somewhere you would feel comfortable traveling as people that criticize the Communist Party?
I don't think we could go back. In fact, I think we would probably not be able to get into Hong Kong. Again, that was already happening to some people we knew in 2019, that they would get stopped at the border and not be allowed into Hong Kong. So I think that is essentially what would happen to us. We would not be allowed in.
Yeah. Worst case scenario would be they would send us to mainland China.
But I don't think I don't think that's the situation in Hong Kong right now. But I do think that essentially all the pro-democracy, almost all the pro-democracy politicians in Hong Kong are either arrested or in exile.
What did we see? There was 1,800 people that were arrested.
There are 1,800 political prisoners in Hong Kong right now. These are people currently in prison.
A lot of them are young people
because of the protests. A lot of them are young. I think the youngest person who was arrested and was 12. So it's this protest was a lot of younger people, a lot of teenagers, a lot of 20-somethings, and I think there's some idea that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to say that the protesters in Hong Kong were violent, so we needed to come in with this national security law and provide stability for Hong Kong. But I have never felt safer at protests than I have in Hong Kong. I felt safer at Hong Kong protests, no matter how far they escalated, than any protests I've been to and covered in the U.S.
Well, so arresting 12-year-olds, that's just what's that, democracy with Chinese characteristics or whatever? Yeah. Full people's democracy? I don't know which one it is, but
yeah,
people's dictator.
The whole situation is because the Chinese Communist Party they can't tell the truth about what they're doing in Hong Kong, right? Which is essentially they are doing what they did in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, what they did in Southern Mongolia to the Mongolian, what they did in Tibet. They are essentially trying to strip Hong Kongers of that Hong Kong identity. They are trying to turn Hong Kong into just another part of mainland China, and patriotic education for people, no protesting at all. Hong Kong used to be the only place where you could have a Tiananmen Square massacre candlelight vigil, and they had one every year until 2020. And now this year, some artist in Hong Kong got arrested for literally making in the air, drawing the symbols for 6489, which is June 4th, 1989, the date of the massacre, got arrested for doing that. So this is kind of the situation that it is in. It is under extreme repression right now, and they are essentially going to continue this until they want to break the spirit of Hong Kong.
Yeah, I don't know why they just rekindled a story that I had. I was doing a semester in Tsinghua in Beijing in I think 2018, and I got assigned to do a report on what did not happen at Tiananmen Square. And I was like, okay, I don't think I'm probably going to be able to finish this semester here, so I'm gonna find another school to get my degree at. But yeah, it's crazy. But as far as the protesters, I know there's another I guess a project or a website that you've set up in sort of, I don't want to say in memory, but an anniversary of this event with the Lenin Wall and people putting, what were they? Sort of notes of inspiration to the protesters, right? And you guys have sort of done something with that. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, Lenin walls have been used in many places over time, but there were very big ones in Hong Kong, and so
they're basically places where people would post messages to support the protesters. And in Hong Kong, they used a lot of Post-it notes. So the Lenin walls in Hong Kong were just these walls. There was the biggest one was right in front of the government complex in Hong Kong, where people were just posting all these Post-it notes to support the protests, and not just Hong Kongers, but people who were there from around the world. And then they also a lot of different areas in Hong Kong, outside subway stations, at the universities in Hong Kong, all these different places, people were posting these Lenin walls to support the protests.
And so what we wanted to do for the 5-year anniversary is create a digital version of this, where people anywhere in the world could leave a note on this digital Lenin Wall with messages of support for the people of Hong Kong.
Or messages of, there's definitely a lot of F the CCP going on on the wall. So, like, messages that would anger the Chinese Communist Party, things to help Hong Kongers feel like they're not alone, like people haven't forgotten what they've done.
And this actually is very important, because we actually just today interviewed a Hong Kong activist, and what the CCP always tries to do is tries to isolate and divide people, to make you feel that you are alone and that nobody knows what's going on, nobody cares about you. And this, we found out that the website has been blocked in China just today. So yeah, I'm very happy that happened. But yeah, so this is important, that people in Hong Kong can see that they are not alone, that the world is still keeping an eye on them and hasn't forgotten them. They haven't moved on to the next thing. And we worked with a team of security experts on this. So it doesn't track IP addresses, doesn't have cookies. It's totally anonymous. So this is really a great and safe way for people anywhere in the world. We've gotten a lot of post-Soviet countries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have people from 67 countries have posted, a lot of Eastern European countries. I think, a lot of people who understand like what communism has done to Hong Kong and to places around the world, and want to show that they don't support the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. It's always no, I was just going to say, it's always the people that come from these communist countries that understand the real ramifications of this. It's not the library Marxists in third period English class that want to extol the Marx and Lenin's beautiful future for humanity. So that doesn't surprise me to see that. But that's really cool. Where can people find this at if they want to take part or support this project?
The website is hkleninwall.com, and Lenin is Lennon.
Like John Lennon.
Imagine.
I mean, the first Lenin Wall was named after John Lennon, but I think it was still an anti-communist Lenin Wall. But,
ironic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see this as a way to. I think a lot of people might think, well, what's the big deal? Like, is it just symbolic? Does this actually do anything? But it really is striking at the core of the CCP's weakness, which is that they cannot tell the truth. They must lie about what they're doing in Hong Kong. They must lie about what they're doing around the world. Otherwise, people would not support them at all. So they need to control the narrative. The CCP is really in on the narrative warfare. What you mentioned earlier about the idea of having these like young Americans talk about how terrible America is and how great China is. This is part of their narrative warfare. So their narrative warfare on Hong Kong is essentially that, Hong Kong was super terrible and chaotic, and now we've brought stability. And this is like the right way to rule Hong Kong, and people are safer and happier now. So the people of Hong Kong can't say anything to go against this right now because they'll be arrested, right? But people around the world can be like, we see you and we know you're lying about this. And that actually is destroying this piece of the CCP's narrative warfare, which they need if they want to continue their takeover of the world, essentially.
They did the same thing with the Tiananmen Square massacre. There are people in China who never have heard about it. And that's one of the reasons why they went so hard on Hong Kong, because people in Hong Kong continued to commemorate it. And they had to silence.
Yeah, I think the information theater is often underestimated in how important it is in warfare, because if you're going to take over a place, you eventually have to win the hearts and minds of those people. And if you're doing that by subversion, if you're doing it by propaganda, if you're doing it by hiding the truth from coming in, it seems like China's kind of ahead of the game on that. So that I want to circle to this last point that I had then. With the election coming up, we have seen what U.S.-China relations look like under Donald Trump. We've seen what U.S.-China relations look like under Joe Biden. Well, we're going to have one of those two again for 4 years. So come November, how would you expect the results of the United States presidential election to affect what China wants to do and U.S.-China relations more broadly?
Well, it definitely will have an impact. I would say that whoever wins, the important thing is that the next administration acknowledges that the Chinese Communist Party is not just a normal government that you can have normal relations with. It needs to be called out as an ideological threat and enemy to the United States, which is something the Trump administration did. They were very good about specifically pointing out, Mike Pompeo in particular.
Robert O'Brien, they made speeches about calling out the Chinese Communist Party and talking about the ideology, which is essentially, again, what the CCP doesn't want, because they want to have the fiction that they are just like any other country, you know, with a president, right? They call Xi Jinping the president of China. He wasn't elected by anybody.
Right.
He's the general secretary of the Communist Party. That is his highest title. That is why he is the quote unquote president of China. In Chinese, it's a different word that they use for president than they use for president of other like democratically elected presidents. So in Chinese, there's a difference, but in English, they through propaganda,
they know what they're doing,
changed it so that it's the same word. So like, you know, people think, oh yeah, the president of China is definitely elected. So they are afraid of people calling out their ideology and recognizing it for what it is.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it is good that the Biden administration has carried on a lot of the tariffs that the Trump administration started. Biden has called Xi Jinping a dictator. He has said he would defend Taiwan. But unless this ideological component is brought out, that is a major weakness of the Biden administration's current China policy.
Well, it seems like every time he would say something like that, he would get immediately contradicted by his staff as well. It's like, whoa, well, that's not what he really meant. He didn't really mean he was a dictator. He didn't really mean that we defend Taiwan. And every time you see Biden speaking, you see Antony Blinken sitting there just cringing out of his, trousers. So I'm not sure there's a lot of continuity between Biden's officials and the Biden administration. So who actually knows what the narrative is?
Well, for example, one thing we heard from a lot of the experts that we've interviewed over the years, that a really good thing the U.S. can do is have Taiwan play a role in RIMPAC, and that is something that is now happening. Good. So that was
something Congress did.
Yeah.
So that it's not only dependent on the administration, although obviously the executive branch in the U.S. is primarily the foreign policy driver in the U.S., but I think there's roles for Congress to play. There's roles for even local, state, and governments in the U.S. because when the Chinese Communist Party comes and they try to subvert U.S. officials, they're not just trying to influence Congress people.
They care more about local elections than Americans do.
They will try to influence local officials, definitely, because they see them as someday this guy could be a congressperson or a president, or even if you're just the mayor of San Francisco or the mayor of New York City, you have a lot of influence, and the Chinese Communist Party wants to get these people on their side.
Yeah, I mean, well, we saw how California cleaned up for, the summit in San Francisco. So to pretend that there's no pull from, Beijing on local officials or even state governors, you kind of have to be blind to make that assumption. But and I don't want to get either of you in trouble. I just want your sincere opinion. Do you, since you mentioned Taiwan, for the prospects of a free and open Taiwan, I know we don't use the term independent legally, but an independent Taiwan from the CCP, is there a better candidate, in your opinion, between Biden and Trump? Who would the Taiwanese rather have in office for the next 4 years?
I don't know if I've ever actually asked any of our Taiwanese connections if there is a preference there. That would be interesting to ask. I don't know which one would be better or worse.
I mean, I do have to say Trump did take a call from the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen. It was one of the first things he did when he was first elected. And I remember this because we were in Asia at the time.
That's right.
I think we were actually were we in Hong Kong?
I think we were in Hong Kong, yeah.
And it made waves because no American president-elect had ever talked to the Taiwanese president.
What I specifically remember about that is somebody had just told me that it happened. When I first heard about it, there was no narrative spin or anything else. So I was just like, oh, that's a good thing. And then I looked at the media reporting, and it was like, Trump is a psycho who's going to get the U.S. I was like, wait, what? Why are they? Why is the media taking the Chinese?
Or the idea was that Trump was too naive and stupid, and that's the only reason.
Yeah.
It was very unflattering to Taiwan, actually, this type of coverage.
Yeah, that was definitely a moment I was like, wait a minute, something's off.
I do have to say, I'm not looking forward to I think there was a big problem during the Trump administration that, like, because the U.S. media will filter everything, of course, through domestic politics and through how they feel about Trump, that, like, a lot of the things happening in foreign policy-wise were very distorted when it came to China. I definitely remember, like, things like that, taking a call from Taiwan and how that was basically seen as, like, the worst thing you could do. Or there was a Hong Kong, like, Congress actually did a great job in 2019 and passed a bunch of bills to support Hong Kong during the protests. And there was one bill that I remember this Washington Post headline that was about how Trump was going to veto this Hong Kong bill.
One, yeah.
And we were getting panicked messages from people we had talked to in Hong Kong being like, is this true? Is he going to veto it? And then the thing is, if you read the Washington Post article, like, in the first paragraph, it went from Trump's going to veto it to Trump may possibly veto it. And then there was no actual, like, there was no support for that line throughout the rest of the entire article. It was like a link to some Fox and
Friends interview where he never said that.
He was like, he was just, like, not committal about it. Like, he didn't say yes. So I don't even know if that was it exactly, but essentially this Washington Post article with a completely false headline, and then 3 days later Trump signed the bill. So it was just, like, kind of creating this drama because of how the Washington Post felt about Trump, but then it had actual ramifications to people, like, you know, halfway around the world, where they were like, is the US actually not supporting us? Like, what's going on? Like, there was, like, a lot of fear and anxiety because a lot of this, you know, reporting was just filtered through whatever was happening domestically in America at the time.
Whoa, let me get this straight. I can't really wrap my head around this. Are you telling me the American mainstream media wasn't completely honest in their reporting?
I'm sorry you had to hear this from me, but yes.
Wow, I have a lot to go back and reevaluate, apparently. Well, thanks for bringing this to my attention.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to hit you both with is, for our audience, if there's one thing, maybe as subject matter experts or people that have spent time in Hong Kong or have a lot, you know, Chinese friends or Taiwanese friends, whatever you want, whatever direction you want to take this, what's one thing our audience should know about China that they might not know?
Ooh, let's see. Well, I think one thing people should keep in mind is that there is a big difference between the Chinese people, Chinese history and culture, and the Chinese Communist Party. That the Communist Party itself is just this ideology is something that is latched on to the idea of China like a parasite. But Shelley, maybe you have something more fun than that?
Don't stop at Temu, please.
Oh God, yes, please.
I mean, it could possibly be a worse app than TikTok in terms of like data collection and all this stuff. Yeah. It's like
it's cheap, but it costs you somewhere else.
Hey, if it's made by slave laborers in Xinjiang or Tibet, who cares? I can get my halter top for $250. It seems like a good deal.
Yeah.
Sadly, yeah. I think that is how.
Well, I mean, I think that there's. I don't think there. When I first saw this Temu ads, I was like, "It's not just some Chinese company who wants to come in and do ads on the Super Bowl, right? Because they're just flush with money." I think it's essentially part of the CCPs trying to weaken the U.S. because if we become reliant on Temu for products and things like that, then it's much easier to be like, okay, well, then we are going to cut you off from the supply chain. You won't be able to get any halter tops.
Dang. There goes my weekend outfit.
Are you the American people going to, like what TikTok tried to do, where they tried to have their people who were on TikTok call the Congress and try to get them to stop the bill about TikTok, right? Where they're like, okay, well, they literally were doing what Congress was afraid was going to happen.
Weaponizing Americans.
Yeah.
And so we're all on the same page. Ban TikTok, correct?
Yeah, I think that, or at least force it to divest from the Chinese company that owns,
which I don't think they're going to do. But
it just shows how dangerous it is. Yeah,
100%.
Yeah. I mean, if TikTok's argument is we're going to be banned because we can't divest because the Chinese Communist Party won't let us.
So a little bit of circular logic there.
Yeah. So I think that shows what the problem here is.
All right. Well, hey, that's all I got for today. I really want to say I do appreciate you guys coming on. Shelley, Chris, I love your program. I hope our audience tunes into you guys. I think there's a lot that they could learn. And feel free to reach out to us anytime for sure.
Absolutely.
And also, if I could get one of those mugs somehow, I'll pay for it. Just send me the link so I can figure that out.
It's so hard to find a mug not made in China.
Right.
We specifically got mugs that aren't made in China, but we'll do our best.
All right. I'll see if I can get you one of these. You don't have to drink it on camera. I won't make you, but we'll send one over anyway.
Great. Well, thank you. It's been great going on. And yeah, China Uncensored on YouTube.
All right. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.